Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April session of Krapar Kini. I'm very excited and we're very honored to have with us today Professor Abraham Terian. Let me go ahead and just give a little introduction to Professor Terian. Not that he really needs it in this crowd, but for all the people watching 50 years from now on YouTube, we'll make sure it's recorded.
I was told this is informal, Jesse, and you're recording it.
We ride the border between formal and informal. Well, born in Jaffa, Israel, Professor Terian grew up in the Armenian compound of the St. James Monastery in the old city of Jerusalem, where he received his early education. For 6 years, he worked as a professional tour guide throughout the Holy Land. He then moved to the US, where he earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in history, biblical languages, and archaeology before earning his PhD in theology from the University of Basel in Switzerland, specializing in early Christianity and its Jewish and Hellenistic backgrounds. The first half of his career was largely devoted to the first century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. And he published 3 books on the works of Philo, specializing especially on those works of Philo that existed in Armenian translation, but whose Greek originals were lost. And here's one of his books, De Animalibus, a work on animals, which we have here at the Zohrab Center. Dr. Terian was professor of intertestamental and early Christian literatures for 20 years at Andrews University in Michigan and served for 4 years as a recurring visiting professor in classical Armenian and Hellenistic Judaism at the University of Chicago. Then from 1997 until his retirement in 2008, he was professor of Armenian patristics at St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary. And I say retirement in air quotes because he's been as active or more in publishing and writing and teaching since his so-called retirement as he was throughout his career. And so over the last 25 years or so, and as recently as earlier this year, he's published voluminously in the field of Armenian Christian studies, translating and writing learned commentaries and studies on classical Armenian works, such as Grigor Magistros's verse epic of the Bible, Magnalia Dei, as well as the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, an important apocryphal work. He translated and did a pretty groundbreaking study on Macarius of Jerusalem, Letter to the Armenians, one of the first documents relating to Armenian Christianity that is very important for liturgical history and liturgical studies. He also published and translated just out recently this year in the Fathers of the Church series, the oft repeated discourses, Hajacha Badum Jark, attributed often to Gregory the Illuminator, but issuing from a slightly later period. He also has 2 recent books on Gregory of Narek. So first was The Festal Works of St. Gregory of Narek, which was a translation, study, very detailed study and commentary on his, you could say, lesser works or the liturgical works, shorter works, hymns and odes and choruses. And then his translation just out also earlier this year of Gregory of Narek's prayer book, also in the Liturgical Press series that the Festal Works was published in. And a couple months ago, he was in Rome speaking on the feast day of Gregory of Narek and presenting his books to the Pope. And so it goes without saying that he's one of the world-renowned experts, if not the world-renowned expert on Krapar, classical Armenian, literature and language. And we're so delighted to have you here with us tonight, Professor Terian. And I thought I would just start out by asking you the question which I ask everyone, which is, can you tell us just a little bit about how you first started studying and learning Krapar?
Well, as you said, I grew up in Jerusalem, actually at St. James Monastery. And the room in which we grew up is literally within the Cathedral of St. James. It is just caved in the adjacent chapel called Echmiadzin. It's the southern side of the cathedral. And this room where we grew up is not only literally within the walls of the cathedral, it is actually closer to the cathedral than the patriarch's residence. So growing up as a child, we grew up with every ringing of the bell or with every ringing of the gochnag. And that would be at 5 a.m. in the morning, listen all the daily services through the evening vespers. In effect, it became part of our everyday life, just tuning our ears to the echoes from the cathedral. But more than that, our family was fortunate to have a very well-learned priest as a family friend. His name was Haigazun Abrahamyan. He was so good in Krapar that Catholicos Vasken recruited him to teach Krapar at Echmiadzin. But he was not in the best of health when he went to Armenia. He just lasted a couple of years there. And he's actually buried very close to the entrance of St. Gayane Church in Echmiadzin. Mm. In fact, next time you're at St. Gayane Church and you face the church, the cemetery is to your left. The nearest tomb to the church is his grave site. Anyway, it's one place I visit every time I go to Armenia. My mother asked him to tutor me in classical Armenian, and he did. Mm. But more than that, at Tarkmanchat School in Jerusalem, we had an equally distinguished, if not a more distinguished scholar in classical Armenian, Norair Bogarian, the late Archbishop, who did all 11, 12 volumes of the catalog of the manuscripts in Jerusalem single-handedly, where he was our Krapar teacher. But I must say that for me, Krapar was the most interesting class because these priestly teachers were kind, whereas all other teachers were committed to physical punishment. And I dreaded them. So anyway, that's how it started.
Great. Well, I'd be very interested before we kind of dive in specifically to prayer 53. Could you just talk a little bit about what it was like to translate Gregory of Narek's prayer book? I mean, it's such a long work. It's a work that is so famous. So many people have written about, so many people have studied. Just a little bit about the process and yeah.
Well, as some of you know, at St. Nerses, our classes are in English, whereas our primary sources are all in Armenian. So from class to class, the instructor is compelled to translate some sample texts to bring to class as handouts. And so in time, these things accumulate. And so the initial translations were actually my own self-imposed class assignments with which I faced our small circle of students at the seminary. I enjoyed doing this for one reason. Being a theologian and well-versed also in Greek thought and things like that, I, first of all, take the text as a challenge. And not only that, most every Armenian classical text I read, it's like crying, translate me, translate me. Well, where shall one begin? There is so much to translate from our rich Christian heritage that you wonder where to begin. But I also took it as a personal prayer. You know, the old monastic distinction between study and prayer does not exist. Your study becomes your prayer, and your prayer becomes your study. So while translating Naregatsi, my wife sometimes would ask, "What were you doing?" Or, well, I say, "I've been praying with Saint Gregory of Narek," when in reality I was translating him. So that's how it grows on me.
Yeah. And why did you choose prayer 53 for us? Of all the 95 we could have looked at, what marks out prayer 53?
Well, here again, I could have picked any prayer in this book, but this did not dawn on me until I was more than halfway through translating the prayer book, that in the mind of the author handling his manuscript or writing his manuscript, or the way he must have envisaged the whole in his mind before he completed it, he must have more or less figured its overall length. And so the middle of the manuscript seemed to be quite climactic to me, because if you were to take any manuscript of the prayer book, there aren't many of them, of course, but if you were to dive right into the middle of the full length of a given manuscript of the prayer book, inevitably it brings you around prayer 53. So I thought this must be something central. And the more I focused on it, the more I began to see how the whole prayer book literally unfolded itself. Because for a mystic like Saint Gregory of Narek, for whom union with God is essential, it's crucial. It's the goal, it's the telos, or the very thing one prays for, union with God. Now, for him, this union with God primarily is sacramental. That is to say, through baptism and through the recurring Eucharist, one constantly or repeatedly connects with God, attains union with God, of course, temporarily in this life and hopefully eternally at the end. But that for him, union with God is sacramental, in that there are two basic sacraments of the church, especially in the New Testament, in the Gospels. Baptism and the Eucharist. And St. Paul explains what baptism is for us in Romans 6, namely death, burial, and resurrection with Christ. As we are immersed in water, we die and are buried with Christ. And when we're lifted out of the water, it's like being resurrected with Christ into newness of life. Baptism becomes initiation into discipleship, and therefore every step thereafter is following Christ as a disciple. We live with Christ and cannot help in his footsteps, ending up where he is ultimately, namely in heaven. So too with the Eucharist. Whereas baptism is once in a lifetime, the Eucharist is a recurring experience of the same, in that we partake of the body and blood of Christ and thus become united with him. And the very privilege of participating in the life of Christ through the sacrament of the Eucharist must have been so overwhelming, mind-boggling, so to speak, for Saint Gregory of Narek, that for him, the very thought of the Eucharist and what it signifies and what it means is precisely where he finds his union with God. This is unlike mystics in general, especially monastics, who thought that by isolation and ceaseless prayer and meditation or concentration, or one can connect with God purely on a rational, intellectual affinity with God. Well, for St. Gregory, this is fine, it's okay. This is the starting point. What makes us want to be united with God is the very fact that we are created in his image. We are rational beings, which is a divine prerogative. It's a heavenly reality with which we humans participate, being created in the image of God, or even the breath of God in us is none other but our capacity to think, our rationality, our intellect. So this kinship we have with God is a starter. We all are created in the image of God. And here St. Gregory of Narek is in harmony with all earlier church fathers of all persuasion, especially the Greek fathers, the Cappadocians, and they picked this up from Hellenistic Judaism. They picked it up from Philo of Alexandria, whom you mentioned in my introduction. For Philo, Genesis 1:27, God created humans in his image, and Genesis 2:7, God breathed in the clay that he made and became a living being. So whether the image of God or the breath of God, whether it's Genesis 1:27 or Genesis 2:7, image or breath of God, it's one and the same, is the logos, is the rationality that we have in common with the divine. But for St. Gregory, this is actually compounded. This kinship we have with God is compounded in the fact that Christ became human and he participated in our humanity, much as we are destined to participate in his divinity. So this double kinship that we have with the divine for Gregory in his mind is just insurmountable. Even if we look at the very end of prayer 52, before we get into prayer 53, he says, this is so mind-boggling that not even the prophets, much less the law of Moses, could even come close to even prefiguring this very thing we call the Eucharist. And of course, we are supposed to read the text and translate, but it's not easy to put in brief what is actually the key to understanding Saint Gregory of Narek. That this sacramental affinity or privilege, rather, that we have to share, to participate in the life of Christ. So whether baptism or the Eucharist is actually participation in the life of Christ. This privilege is, come to think of it with Saint Gregory, is much too much. And for him, that's everything. Now, of course, we cannot talk about Saint Gregory without the Tondrakians of his time. And here I'll be very brief. The Tondrakians, from what we gather from Saint Gregory's own writings, all other sources about the Tondrakians, other than what we gather from Narek, namely Saint Gregory of Narek and his abbot Ananya of Narek, I would consider all other sources on the Tondrakians as unreliable. These Tondrakians are demonized in the sources, and to the point that I dare say in Armenian studies, up until now, nobody could even identify who these Tondrakians were. But I venture to identify them simply from what I gather from Saint Gregory of Narek and from his abbot Ananya Naregatsi, of whom Jesse could tell us more. What they have to say about the Tondrakians really makes it possible for us to identify them. The very name Tondrakians is not a personal name, not even based on a place name. There is no such place in geography called Tondrak. Simply because there are Tondrakians, some people have tried to put a dot on the calendar and say, this is where Tondrak is, to explain Tondragetsi or Tondrakians, as if they have come from a place called Tondrak. There is no such place, nor is it a personal name. So a movement that derives its name not from a person nor from a place, but rather from their belief system, their doctrine. If I were to take the word Tondrakian and put it in Greek letters, I get a Greek word. Theandrikoi. In Armenian, this will mean Astvadzatsial Martik, people who thought they could become divine. How? Well, we know of similar movements in antiquity, much more so after Saint Gregory of Narek and more so in Greek circles, where there were people, and this is biblical, that humans can become divine. In the Psalms, it says, you are gods. It's a psalm quoted in the Gospel of John. You are gods. We're created in the divine image. We are restless, so to speak, until we connect with the divine and become divine. Well, ultimately, that's our destiny as humans. That's the very thing from where we fell through sin. And redemption from sin means being back with God as one. But that for these mystics, this would be through isolation, ceaseless prayer, concentration of the divine, so much so that this become to rob the sacramental basis of this union with God. So for St. Gregory of Narek, this notion of the sacraments as the all-embracing theology that explains our relationship to God, both before the fall, in the fall, through the sacraments, and eventually through the telos, or the ultimate goal of the redemption that we have in Christ. This is invariably related to the Eucharist. And to go back to the manuscript, it is very interesting that by the time you have come about 1/4 in the manuscript, like in the prayers in the 30s, where the prayers in the 30s began, it is all confession of faith. Much as the whole book is confession of sin, there is also confession of faith, as if confession of sin and confession of faith go hand in hand. So, and when you move past the middle of the manuscript for another 1/4 of the total length of the manuscript, when you come to the prayers in the 70s, there again you have repeated confession of faith. So in other words, what we have in the very middle of the book about the Eucharist is flanked on both sides, equidistant in the manuscript, with confession of faith, which is part and parcel of the Badarak. And to make the picture complete, contrary to those Armenologists who think that the concluding prayers of the prayer book are not original, I would say certainly not. They are wrong. These prayers are an integral part of the prayer book, because, and here's a catch, this is very important. Prayer 75, that is by the time you have moved 3/4 in the book, okay? Prayer 75, by the time you come 3/4 in the book, again, equidistant from the middle, okay? It's his major prayer on the church. You know, these prayers are at the same time instructional. He's teaching us all about ecclesiology in prayer 75. What is very interesting is that when you look at prayer 72, it's a criticism of the Tondrakians. Prayer 72 is a criticism of those who think they attain divinity without the church or without the Eucharist, or by downplaying the significance of the sacraments that the church has to offer. If you think why the church authorities would turn against the Tondrakians, it would be because of their belief system. They have diluted the significance of the sacraments. And the church is the place for the sacraments. And so you would see how, after rebuking the Tondrakians in prayer 72, he is edging closer to his lengthy prayer or instruction on the significance of the church. And when we come to the end of the book, you have prayer 91, 92, and 93. The one on the Gotchnak, the Simantron, the church bell. What is the significance of the church bell? The church bell is calling you to church, the place where the sacraments are administered. And that lengthy prayer on the Miron, the significance of the Miron, it's all about baptism. In other words, while the centrality of the prayer book is on the Eucharist, let's not forget the locus, the place for the Eucharist, namely the church. And the prayer book culminates with a call to the church and connecting the Eucharist with the other great sacrament, which is baptism, and which in the Armenian church, as you know, it's not without the consecration with the Miron, the sealing with the Miron. And what this sign of the cross made with the Miron literally means. What it means is that it is the divine mark upon us that seals us with Christ, to the point that even in the grave, when this body disintegrates, this sign of the cross with which we have been marked at our baptism, this sign remains. It remains as an incorruptible mark because it is the sign of Christ. And Christ sees no corruption. That while our corruptible body disintegrates in the grave, the sign of the cross with which we have been anointed remains. And this will be the marker that the angels recognize during the resurrection. And so with that, we are sealed for eternity with Christ. Anyway, that's just the summation of the book, just to show you where the middle of the book is and the significance of it. If you go to the very end of prayer 52, before we jump into 53, you will see it for yourself as to where he wants to take the reader or the person who is praying with him.
Yes. And right before we turn to the text, I just wanted to ask you one last kind of more technical question, I guess, about the translation, which is that in many of the recent translations of Narek's prayer book in various languages, you open it up and it all looks like poetry. It's all in kind of lines and verses. And it's notable that in your translation, it's kind of a mix, maybe predominantly prose, with a great number of poetic passages. So can you just explain how you distinguished, between, say, prose and poetry, and why you arranged the lines the way you did?
Yeah. Well, having worked with the previous odes and litanies of Saint Gregory of Narek, that previous book that you showed, I don't have one near me. I can grab one. Okay, so having worked through this, being familiar with the way Saint Gregory writes poetry, I have immersed myself not just in his poetry, but the genre of poetry in medieval times. Even one of the books you showed by Grigor Magistros, who is a late contemporary of Saint Gregory of Narek. He outlived Saint Gregory of Narek by half a century. So once you are familiar with medieval poetry, even in its Greek form, which among our Armenian authors is, I wouldn't say it's imitative, but it's an established genre. They were doing with Armenian what others were doing with Greek. You begin to see certain poetic forms, and there are about a dozen of them. Whether it's meter or rhyme or alliteration, it need not be all rhyme, but that is only, rhyme is only part of it. Let's say it's 1 out of 12 ways of writing poetry back then. You begin to discern what is poetry and what is not. But here again, let me say that there is poetic prose and there is poetic verse. So the whole thing is poetic, but there is a distinction I make between poetic prose and poetic verse. Not everything in the prayer book is verse. In fact, it makes better sense as prose. And not only that, when the author wrote it, there was no such thing as you find it in the published editions where everything is cast as poetry. For one thing, they couldn't afford it parchment-wise to write like that. And not only that, and this is good to bear in mind, up through the end of the 10th century, and not until into the middle of the 11th century, Armenian was written in Yergatakir. It's only at the turn of the 11th century, after St. Gregory of Narek, that we have transitioned from Yergatakir into other forms of script in Armenian manuscripts. And so all things together mitigates casting the whole thing as poetry. Now, of course, in Armenia, when under communism, they wanted to justify publishing the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek, they had to make a good case to persuade the communist authorities to okay its publication. And the argument they made, and they won with the argument, and thank God for what they did, they argued that this whole thing is poetry. And even to this day in Armenia, you meet old-timers like of my generation who refer to it as Gregory's poetry. Not the prayer book, but Gregory's poetry. And curiously enough, through the 20th century, it was not always published as poetry. In fact, the initial publications or editions of the book were as prose.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, well, let's spend some time with the text itself. And maybe I'll pull up.
Maybe it's time to sip a little wine.
That's right. And we forgot to even say a toast at the beginning, which we usually do. So, Krapar Kini, you have Professor Abraham Teriani, you have Mer Polorin Ganatsa.
Well, thank you. I may add one little sentence here. Last week I turned 80. So it's a turning point in my life. For the first time, I'm identifying as octogenarian. It's sinking in, but I have a hard time getting over it, that I've turned 80 in the last week.
Well, happy birthday anyways.
Well,
Yes.
thank you. All right, well, maybe we should turn into the text. Well, Jesse, you know best how your participants go about participating. Maybe you can guide us from here on.
Sure. So pull up the text here. you can see already here, this is, taken from the main edition, how it's all divided up into lines as if poetry, but in Professor Terian's translation of this part, much of this prayer 53 is laid out as prose, poetic prose. And that's actually helpful to know when you're translating and reading it, because you might be tempted to think, by the way the lines are broken, to like read each line as a unit in itself and then try to get everything in the next line. But for example, looking at the start of section 2, where it suggested we focus some of our attention, the main declined verb doesn't come until the 4th line. And so it's helpful to think of the line breaks not as rigid as, being sense divisions. So would someone like to read the first few lines or so to get started?
Maybe before we start reading, I should say something. The first part, which we are skipping, it's actually talking about how nothing is impossible with God. Upon further reflection, to think, why would he think about all these things that are not impossible with God? It's conceivable that he is thinking about the transubstantiation as well, that these elements of the sacrament are to become, whether symbolically or indeed, the body and blood of Christ, this transformation of things. And of course, the transforming power of the Eucharist. But it's very interesting section that we're just skipping, which is nonetheless an integral part of the prayer.
Sure. So anyone to read to get started?
Come on, it's not all that difficult.
I'll give it a try.
Okay, Andrew, please.
From Penn, correct?
Yes.
Ail ar shnor norok pergutianus, pasmok kohapanutiam hedevial, I hajachutun anpavitsen, L'Oreal ar semin iskuin gargetsa. Shall I keep going?
Maybe that's a good place to stop,
Okay.
to start out. Did you get a chance to prepare any of this, or would you like to hazard a translation?
I didn't get a chance to prepare. I could try to muddle through it as best I can.
Sure.
You said the verb was at the very end of that 4th line. But arshnor norok. Toward the grace, no.
Or you could say, as regards to this grace.
As regards to this grace, norok pergutianus. To new salvation? No, norok.
Yeah, good.
Okay. Pasmok. Following with all following words of thanksgiving.
Accompanied with?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Say again?
Accompanied with much thanksgiving?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I hajachutun. Haja. Ampavitsan. Unpavitsan. Well, hajachutun. What is frequency? I think hajach.
Mhm.
Unpavitsan. I don't know. Or on at least on Pava, I'm not sure.
That's infinity in the immeasurable tank of
Oh.
things immeasurable.
Okay.
In the abundance of the unlimited.
Mhm.
Or
Larry.
ablative.
Yeah,
To that effect.
or locative.
L'Oreal.
Maybe the verb will help us put the whole to cast the whole thing properly.
God gets so those Gargim.
Mm-hmm.
Gargim. No, I don't recall that verb. Gargim. That's
It's interesting.
Yeah.
This part relates precisely to what you were saying earlier, Professor Terian, about him being just overwhelmed and unable to kind of express.
Dumbfounded.
Yeah.
Dumbfounded, struck dumb, or
Yeah.
Right. And
So,
it
like,
goes with L'Oreal Gargets. These two
Mhm.
words go together.
Oh. Oh, I see. I was gonna Lord. He's going.
So
Oh,
is
right.
Samin like a type of pronoun? It's like a declined pronoun. Samin.
Samin is from Soin,
Sama, it's a
Okay.
demonstrative.
the same.
This very thing.
Right. Okay.
This very thing. We have Nuin in
But it's declined. It's like a declined form of that, right?
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oops. Okay.
So putting it all together, what is he saying?
he's dumbfounded by his salvation. He can't comprehend it.
Yes.
The enormity, the immeasurableness of it. Yeah. It's just too much to ponder.
I have a question. If hajachutun, is that say locative because it uses the he? But why do we say that in modern Armenian using hajach?
Well, you have the preposition I hajachutun.
Is
You
that
could also translate it by the hajach does not necessarily or always mean frequent. Hajachel could also means to attend, to participate.
Right.
But here it's of course a noun, it's not a verb. It could also be an instrumental by this very enormous hajachutun could also be an outpouring, something that is just inundating.
Okay.
By the inundation of this enormity of things. If the
Why is-
context was different, the word hajachutun could also mean the torrent of things
Mhm.
or the outpouring.
But it seems like in our translation, we used it as an adjective almost, but in the original, it's a noun.
Yeah, lexically it is a noun. Lexicographically, it's a noun. Hajachutun. And the most literal meaning would be frequency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Jesse. But you don't decline hajachutun when you put the E in front of it?
It's accusative, isn't it?
I haven't done this Krapar class in a while,
Yeah.
so I forgot.
When so there's three ways you can do ini. One is with accusative or vocative, and then it's not declined. Like it doesn't show its
Oh, I see. Okay.
declension with a special ending. And then when it takes the ablative, that's when it has the A at the end of the word. So if it was,
Okay. So when you say, when you're using it to mean in, it doesn't decline. The word doesn't decline.
yeah,
Doesn't become declined.
most words will not.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so should we go on to the next part?
Yeah, I'll try it.
Yeah, go for it, Harry.
Kanzi gergneal as lusuit anaspar parisit voriken ar im hamares tishvarution coin agirsiv arkez machtetzits harmarial tartial I nutus panis as dar vopercutian aiser madeni litsits tachtutiampuk yev hedzedzanok.
Great.
So since again in the light of your no, I mean I don't know the grammar. I know Luis is obviously light.
Yeah,
This seems like it's a anaspar is unfailing
good.
or
Unending.
unending. It doesn't run out, right?
Yeah,
Right.
And pari, it seems like it's goodness,
good.
pari, right?
Yep.
So your unending goodness is something
Yeah.
like that. Is the S is the se because it's plural,
Yep, exactly.
and the T is referring to it belonging to God.
Yep.
So
Very good.
Because
So-
the repeating of your unending light, is that
the unfailing goodnesses of your light.
Mhm.
Okay. Which from you to me,
Mhm.
no.
Yeah,
The R is, why is it R im? Or is it towards my
yeah.
Hamares Teshvarution? Well, Hamar can mean stubborn. But is this Amar like the season of summer, or is it the word stubborn? And Teshvarution is miserable, misery.
Yeah,
Obstinate misery.
very good.
My obstinate misery.
That I like that.
Towards my obstinate misery. Oh. But why is the Hamaris have an S on the end?
It's often done to kind of signify, it signals that what's being mentioned relates to the speaker or his space. So it's kind of like a possessive.
Yeah.
Sure, but why wouldn't that be at the end of Tishvar Tunis?
It's
Because-
directed toward him.
The say can be
It's with
placed
reference to
either
him.
way.
Oh, really? Okay.
It doesn't have to go on the noun.
Koyin alersiv arkez machtetzitz. Well, it's like through your requests or your
Yeah,
agersank, I will offer to you. I will offer to you through your supplications.
Very good. But actually here, this is very interesting. Agers is also petition or prayer. Koin agersiv, it's instrumental, of course. So,
With prayer to you, I shall implore you.
yeah, I shall implore you by your very own prayer.
Right.
And this is a very important line because this line is often wrongly taken as an allusion to the Lord's Prayer. In other words, St. Gregory is about to pray very much like Jesus taught us the Lord's Prayer. Whereas I take it as an allusion to the prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17, the prayer in the upper room when he celebrated the Eucharist with his disciples. So in other words, in effect, Gregory of Narek is giving us a clue as to how he's proceeding through the prayer book. He's doing it in the pattern of, or a la, Jesus' own prayer, and the setting here is the Eucharistic prayer. It's John 17 and not the Lord's Prayer. Which then the next line tells you what he's going to do with it.
Okay. Well, that means like again fitted
yeah,
to the subject of my words or of these words.
Exactly.
Composed again.
Fitting it again.
Har Marial is like something to be fitting to something else.
Right.
As dar vo perhutian aiser madeni, the letters, the letter of the lamentation of this book. I will fill with, these are like words that mean weeping or sighing or something. I don't know the exact meaning.
Yeah.
So I'll feel, yeah.
So for me, this is a very key passage. It's the author's hint as to what he's doing. And I trust you see it that way.
Yes, definitely.
When he mentions in the first line, when he says that the repeating of your light, is he saying because he's been repeating about the light of God since I keep repeating about this? Is that what he's talking about? Or
Very good, because in you recall his prayer to the Holy Spirit. He has a two-part prayer. I believe it's in prayer 33:6 or somewhere thereabouts. Let me check it. Where he says, I shall repeat this Eucharistic prayer. Even in our Badara Kamadu, it's in the Divine Liturgy of the Armenian Church. If you're familiar with it, there's a place where the celebrant prays the prayer of Saint Gregory of Narek. It is a prayer to be repeated until such a time when this divine light literally dawns on him or strikes him.
right, yeah.
So, and of course, the Eucharist is a recurring sacrament that every time he comes to celebrating the Eucharist, of course, he's recalling what Christ himself did in the upper room with his disciples, but that it is here to be repeated all over again.
Then, Dr. Terian, I have another question. When he says, I will implore you, doesn't machtel also mean to offer something? Or it means to ask something?
It's machtel in our vernacular today would be a wish or machtank. And it is, of course, an offering. The Eucharist itself is a thanksgiving, an offering of thanksgiving to God. The whole thing is offered to God. Arkes machtetzitz.
That's what I'm asking. So when he
Yeah.
says arkes machtetzitz, is he talking about he's machtetzitz, he's machteling this discussion or this repetition of the goodness of the light? In other words, the machtetzitz refers to the first two lines. Is that possible or no?
Well, this very thing which is from him, in other words, the initial prayer is by the Lord himself. It's like saying, from thine own unto thee we offer.
Right.
So it's a prayer initially offered by Christ, and now he is kind of offering it back to him. And in fact, the whole prayer book as itself, the way he perceives it, is a rational offering offered back to God, the very giver of reason,
Right.
who has created us rational beings, that has enabled us to come up with such a rational sacrifice. And not only that, Christ himself is the Logos, who himself was offered as sacrifice. So here we have an overlap, if you please, a conflation of rational sacrifices. We have a conflation of prayers. He's conflating the Lord's Prayer with his own prayer. He's conflating the rational sacrifice of Christ with this Badarak or the Eucharist, which he is offering. If you can see the conflation of things in this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that that's the essential meaning of sacrament and the work of a Christian priest, is to take the gifts God has given and offer them back to God. That's the whole ladana.
Exactly, right. It's actually a prayer by Saint John Chrysostom. From thine own unto thee we offer. So
I was just wondering, no, that was beautiful, but I was just wondering why there's no verb on the second line. I guess that's really what I was asking. And if the second line's verb is macht et sitz.
well, it's let sitz tach zu tiampet it's a rock.
Okay.
In other words, he's going to sprinkle this throughout his book.
Okay.
His whole book is going to become a rational sacrifice. In fact, the oldest manuscript of the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek illustrates this in the 4 full-page illuminations that we have. In the first one, he's praying. In the second one, pleading on his knees. The last picture is him presenting the book to Christ. So the book itself becomes the Eucharist. It's like saying, I'm going to spread this formula all over.
Right.
The formula of your prayer.
Who wants to continue? Matt, we haven't heard from you yet.
So you want me to read the Armenian, huh? I'll do my best. I'll Arial Harnetzitz e Tuvogid Hajutun und Savotzen as Degen und Vahadutianen as Karach Goisen. This is a tough one. As Usahadutianen as Hishadagen an van Hasdogid und de Kurtunanen thus Popansent. Thanks a lot, Jesse.
Okay. Well, let me help you a little bit. If you look here, you're at a very interesting point in the prayer where he's transitioning from prose to poetry. And you can see how the lines begin with and. So this is a poetic form. This is an established poetic form where the lines begin with identical words and repetitiously.
I'll try to keep going. Und imumus tarnutian as kagstrutun genararid und badij urinin a schnorn und parstus an id sitzen zazadarar nutunit und marno mahun zamanainiv norogotunit. That's the best I can do for reading.
You did very well.
Just for reference, Jesse, isn't Narek considered like the hardest version of classical Armenian that exists?
It's not easy, but I think Professor Terian has worked on more difficult texts.
actually the most difficult Armenian is referred to as Hellenizing school Armenian, where the words are Armenian, but the sentence is Greek. And it went on for a couple of centuries, from the 6th into the 7th and into the 8th. Anyway, that's a different subject. Yes, there is more difficult classical Armenian.
But this is still pretty hard.
Yes.
Wait, sorry, I didn't understand. You mean the words are Armenian, but sort of the grammar is Greek?
Yeah, the whole syntax is Greek.
So Matt, do you want to say what you got for your translation?
Yeah, whether it's right or, well, some of it wasn't that bad. The first sentence, but receiving I shall combine in the pleasure of your giving.
Mm-hmm.
Medicine instead of pains. Encouragement instead of despair.
No. I would correct the more immediate meaning of "ant" is with.
Excuse me?
"Ant." He's going to blend these two. He's not going to replace one with the other.
Okay.
Oh, because he says cardinate seats.
Mm-hmm.
Is that our clue to knowing that that's how he's using it?
Yeah.
So encouragement and despair, just as rendered as and instead of with.
Or no,
Yeah.
with, you had originally said instead of,
Okay.
and he
All
was
right.
correcting that to with.
Yeah.
Okay.
With pains the cure. "Ant tsavotzen ըստեղը." With the pains the cure. "Ant
That was-
v'hapyanën ըսխրախույսն." With disillusion or despair, encouragement.
Okay, then with recollection of your sustaining name, hopelessness, or backwards, hopelessness with recollection of your sustaining name.
Yeah. In other words, you notice also here there's a blend of the human and the divine. You know, the ugly part is from us, the better part is from God. You know, when these two come together, the human and the divine.
With grief, your consolation.
Mm-hmm.
With my bitterness, your life-giving sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
With the punishment, Jesse's still typing.
Genanarit is a direct address to God. It's Skasutun genararit. The loving kindness or sweetness
Okay.
of your.
With the punishment of the law, grace.
Mm-hmm.
With the depths of the curse, your liberating blessings.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the death of the body, your restoration. So I was reading unt and genitive as instead.
Yeah. Yeah, Zamenaniv norokutuna, your total restoration.
Is that like your restoration of all things?
Of all things, right?
So Professor Terian, can you just comment on like what exactly he's saying.
Very
with all this.
So if we take it as a Eucharist, kind of a Eucharistic prayer, or invariably related to Christ's Eucharistic prayer, as it was earlier talked about, offering back to God that which is initially from him, but now it's coming back to God through human instrumentality. And the human element here is emphasized. It's very interesting that throughout his thought pattern, there is this divine descent, ascent. So these divine things, while they are blessings and good things, and they come from God, they are being transmitted back to heaven through these weak, human, feeble, sinful instrumentality. And so Christ, having participated in the human experience, he's well acquainted with these. In other words, these things are already blended in the incarnation of Christ, and that the redemption that the incarnation brings makes the world of difference in what we humans experience. We not only experience pain, but thank God we also have the remedy. We not only are disillusioned or hopeless or disappointed, but we have encouragement, we have cheer. And just the very recollection of the Lord's name itself is a remedy for hopelessness. That there is hope in just invoking the name of the Lord. And so this contrast between the divine and the human, and the blend of it is in the very incarnation. And also in us humans who are redeemed. Redemption is both an ongoing thing as well as a realized eschatology. For the mystics, redemption is a realized eschatology. But we're still here, we're still experiencing these things. And they are just as real as our redemption is real.
Great. Well, we're not going to be able to get through all of the next part, but maybe we can start it. Ava, would you like to, if you're there, would you like to read?
Yes.
Read a little?
Yeah, I'll read it, and I must confess that I cheated again, and I happen to have the Krapar Kini and an English on my desk, and I had great difficulty matching them up. Somehow, at times, the Krapar by Torkom Surpasan, who was the first translator, I believe, is not matching to the English, and then we hear it's matching altogether. So I'm very confused. So you gotta help me. Matt has to help me. Nominated.
Don't worry.
Okay, I'm reading the. That's a positive response, right, Matt?
Yes, I will do my best.
You all are doing very well.
Yes.
Hymn, third section of this chapter. It says, Havadam is havrit pani usti begayem, lur lurutian sirdes der Jesus, vor hunchumen arkez medutian tsaini yergar kochelo, vor marnagits yev batgeragits mer yeryal. Right. And one of the arts of reading Armenian, I guess, is to know the punctuations and where to stop, where to make a half stop, which is, I lost it long time ago.
That's okay.
And if I take a shot of translating from the Torkum Surpazan's translation in Armenian, Ashkarapar Armenian, it says, I believe your words, therefore I testify. Avadam is Varigid Panistri Vagayam. So I don't know if it's correct. I believe in your word, in your strong words, and that I testify. Jesus, our Lord Jesus, listen to my heart's silence or emptiness, perhaps, which is, it's a long appeal. Long appeal is a long sound, a strong sound from me toward you. You who became like us, became like our body, you became our picture. Եվ իբրև կայնաբեդ անօրինագդ օրինագին լուծխարով եւ կայնաբեդության ըս անավարինագիտ զուվերինագին ըզվարին խարդակյալ զլուց very badly. And as the head of our church, or
Chief priest.
perhaps,
Well, as high priest,
chief priest, chief rabbi, head priest, and you destroyed the Anorinagat Orinagin. You, with the order, you destroyed the disorder?
no,
I don't know if
You-
it's correct.
you
You
go
shattered the yoke.
yeah,
I'm sorry.
I have as the chief priest of your incomparable example, you shattered the yoke.
okay.
Excellent.
Anorinag is the antitype and the type. You have the orinag is the type and the anorinag is the type. So Christ brings the antitype, whereas the law is the type. So is the high priest who did away with the high priest as the antitype, as the antitypical high priest did away with the type. You know, he's doing a contrast between what Christ offers and what the Jewish cultic system had to offer through the high priest. So Christ, as our high priest, does away with the types because he is the antitype. He's the real thing. He's the real high priest. So it's a contrast. It's actually drawing on the epistle to the Hebrews, where in the epistle to the Hebrews, Christ is presented as our high priest, and that this high priest is well acquainted with humanity. And unlike offering animal blood, he did it with his own blood. And therefore, Christ is the antitypical high priest. And he offers himself as sacrifice that does away with all the type that we have in the Old Testament and in the books of Moses that are done away with. So that's the thought. Well, what makes the language and the thought of St. Gregory complicated is that it's never, I repeat that, it's never ever a single thought, but it is compounded thoughts. And they often come as clusters. never as a single thread. And when you think of a biblical imagery, believe it or not, there are others clustered with it. It's never one image. It's never one thought. Everything is compounded.
I have a question. So when you're saying he's like the antitype, is it sort of like in Galatians where he writes, neither Jew nor Greek, meaning nothing can be limited in Christ in some way to become Christ-like?
Well, no, the contrast here is between what Christ to offer by way of redemption and what you have by way of the Jewish cultic system. These
Yeah.
animal sacrifices and whatever the Jewish high priest does, especially on the Day of Atonement. These kinds of Old Testament sacrifices that are done away with once Christ is sacrificed. Here I'd like to tell something maybe for the benefit of all of you, more so if you are exposed to Protestant thought or criticism directed toward us who are Orthodox. You may have heard it yourselves when they tell us Christ suffered once and for all, according to the epistle to the Hebrews. Why do you Armenians keep offering Badarak? You keep sacrificing Christ all over again, when in scripture it says Christ was offered once and for all. Have you heard that?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So our response is that we're not offering Christ all over again. We are participating all over again in that one and once and for all sacrifice. It is we who are bringing our participation into that one all-sufficient sacrifice. In other words, the Protestant criticism directed toward the Orthodox who keep offering Badarak is based on total misunderstanding. Do you follow me?
Yes.
It is we who are participating. See, Christianity is participation in the life of Christ. The Eucharist as well as the baptism, just as baptism is death, burial, and resurrection with Christ, so is the Eucharist. We partake of Christ's body and blood. We share his life. We join his life. We're bringing ourselves to join into that one sacrifice. So it's a memorial of that sacrifice. It's not repeating the sacrifice. We're commemorating that once and for all sacrifice through our participation, through our repeated participation. And the difference between baptism and the Eucharist is that since baptism is once in a lifetime thing, the Eucharist is a recurring thing, is a constant participation in the life of Christ.
Jesse, can I offer a suggestion?
Yeah.
Can we skip, because we're not going to finish this, can we skip ahead to where it starts, Iskiete? Because I think there it's getting into some really important stuff.
Down here.
Yeah. And that's also got the one with the line with the 4 eames in it, which is kind of nice.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And I'll volunteer to read it because I suggested it, even though it might not sound too good.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And I'm not going to go, I'm going to do 4 lines and stop there and then maybe go farther than that.
Maybe, let me see. Harry, do you want to read it? And then we'll have Matt translate.
Sure. Iskiete amenitsit Astvad an Kenin, imovus vasen im ar im pergutiun itemes im, iperte antkoyet eutian yes itsem, marmnov barunagorit getsort miatsial.
Great.
Okay, so I had yet if inscrutable God of all, with my, for the sake of my, and toward my salvation before me, as though I may be with your essence. And I'm doing it line by line, which may not be the right way to do it.
You're right on. You're on the right track.
United, partaking with your encompassing body.
You're into a very key passage here. And you recall in my remarks before we started translating how this compounded or dual affinity or kinship we have with God, right? We're related to him first by virtue of the fact we are created in his image. There is a divine element in us. And yet he became incarnate. We're related to Christ due to the fact that he became human. He partook of our humanity. So he's really dwelling on that thought in these lines. And let's see what he's saying.
So the way Matt translated this part, Mamanov Barunagi Gatsot Miatsial, united, partaking with your encompassing body. But it's really what he's saying is you united and were enclosed in a body, right?
Yeah. But Christ did this sacrifice through his human body. That since Christ, in other words, the human body has now an elevated significance due to the fact that Christ partook of it. And this gives us license, kind of, to approach God with our humanity, as is. Christ did it in human nature, and therefore human nature is acceptable to God.
Can I ask a theological question?
Sure.
Well, I'm trying to understand, he's clearly seems to be addressing, as you pointed out, some kind of theological controversy of the time. And I'm wondering, is this directed at the schism, at scholasticism somehow, where he's really emphasizing, what you might say Athanasian Orthodox theology? God became man so man can become God. And that incarnationality is what this is all about, and that we're not going to be saved without it, period. So is he addressing scholasticism here, since it's the time of the schism, or something else?
Not quite. His emphasis here is on the overwhelming significance of the incarnation. Christ was born to die. You and I were born not to die, but to live. But anyway, sin got in, and so we became mortal. And so when Christ, who is immortal, put on what is by nature mortal, there is a transformational thing here, the beneficiaries of which are we humans, and that we experience this through the Eucharist. In other words, the Eucharist gives us this affinity with God that is our privilege now by virtue of the fact that Christ partook of the human body. When we think of his contemporaries, I don't think he's thinking beyond the Tondrakians, whom I mentioned earlier, who think they can attain this immortality and affinity with God simply through prayer and meditation and seclusion. Whereas for Gregory, it is sacramental, and the locus for it all is in the church. Not in your seclusion, not in your cell, but in the church.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're kind of running to the end of our time, but maybe just to conclude, I'll read the end of this section, and then Professor Terian, could you read your translation?
Well, my translation may be a bit difficult to follow. It's not interlinear as you typed it, but
That's
anyway,
okay.
I can read part 3 of, I think the key passage is 53:3.
Yeah, I think if you are at the top of,
I'll read it slowly, but you can follow the Armenian.
okay.
I believe, Almighty, in your word. Remember, he's praying to Christ. Your word, singular. Hence, I confess. It's also a confession of faith, right? It's not only a confession of sin, but it's a confession of faith. I confess. Hear the silence of my heart, Lord Jesus, which is the loud reverberation of my prolonged cry to you. You partnered with our body and image, and as high priest, the antitype who took away the yoke of the type, you offered your lauded body instead of animals slaughtered for sacrifice. You continue to be offered perpetually in an undying manner, and to grant undiminishing pardon, not only to those of few sins, but also to those for whom there seems to be no hope at the end of life. How could bodily members inclined towards sin foster life, even if they were to carry on for countless years? For this reason, you, God of all, who of your own free will took upon yourself to be the sacrifice, enduring death, are distributed for our atonement. Not that you, source of purity, have to die daily as a debtor to death. Rather, it was your will to be offered perpetually for our reconciliation, with the cooperation of your Spirit, and to please the Father. Since you, inscrutable God of all, took on my semblance for my sake and for my salvation, I too am united with you and participate in your very being through your all-embracing body. And you, benefactor, for me and those like me, took my sins upon yourself through you, though you were sinless, accepted death that was the punishment meted out for me, and endured guilt in my name. As would be the case, I suffer willingly with you, who die often, yet remain alive, who is offered through the divine mystery and is distributed in indivisible pieces, not by the hands of those who deny you, but by the faith of those who confess you. This is sacramental theology at its best. That even the priest who offers the Eucharist could be sinful and his hands are impure, yet the sacrament itself transcends that, or its meaning rather.
Wonderful. Well, you gave us so much to ponder with the opening words and looking at some of these dense lines.
Well, the challenge is now yours to see how this is, in fact, spread all over the book. Anyway, Jesse, thank you for the opportunity to share this little with your interested group. I think you all are to be commended, not just for your interest, but I believe you're with it. Keep it up.
Well, thank you very much. This is absolutely fascinating.
And never forget,
Thank
we
you.
all were beginners at one time. So the more you read an author, and especially if you read him over and over and over again, even if you understand him but little in the beginning, but the more you read him, eventually, in time, and this may happen after you've read it 20 times or even 50 times or 100 times, but the more you read an author over and over and over again, I bet in time you begin to think with him. Anyway, keep it up.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Terian. And thank you everyone for coming and for your attention and participation. And as I
Thank you. This was
announced
great.
last time, in our next session, we'll look at a colophon together. And I'll be leading that based on a unpublished gospel manuscript colophon that I'd been working on recently. And so I'll share that with you, the text of that in the coming days. And then we'll look at that together on, I think it's Monday, May 23rd, but I'll send out an email confirming all of that. All right, well, thank you again and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.